The cold usually gets the blame for what frontier winters did to people. But out on the Great Plains, for the families who built their shelter right, the cold was rarely the thing that killed you. Their walls were cut from prairie sod, blocks of solid earth 2 to 3 feet thick, and they held heat so well that one small stove could warm a room, even while it was 40 degrees below zero outside. What actually threatened them was running out of things to burn and getting lost in a whiteout between the house and the barn. This is how one family engineered their way through a winter that buried the plains for half a year. It's the spring of 1879, somewhere on the open grassland of central Nebraska, and a young family has just stepped down from a loaded wagon onto 160 acres of land the government handed them for almost nothing. The prairie grass rolls in every direction, taller in places than a grown man, all the way to the horizon. And there's one thing missing from that whole view: there are no trees. For a family that grew up building everything out of timber, that's a serious problem because winter is coming and they have no lumber to raise a single wall. What they do have is the ground itself. The prairie underneath their feet isn't ordinary dirt. Centuries of buffalo grass and big blue stem have packed it with roots so dense and so tangled that a slab of it holds together like a brick. Settlers across the plains had already figured out what this meant. If you couldn't build with wood, you could build with the earth. They called the homes that came out of this idea soddies, and they called themselves sodbusters. By the time this family arrived, sod houses were spreading across the treeless plains, and Custer County, Nebraska, would become known as the sod house capital of the world. Before the full house goes up, many families on the plains carve a quick dugout straight into the side of a low hill or a creek bank, using the bank itself for 3 of the walls and a layer of sod for the roof. It's cramped and dark, but it's earth-sheltered and warm, and it buys them time while the real home takes shape. A proper sod house, though, is a different level of work entirely. Building one was a skill, and getting it wrong could cost you the winter. The family starts in the morning, when the moisture in the ground is high and the sod is heavier and easier to handle without crumbling. They hitch a horse to a breaking plow and drive it through the unbroken prairie, peeling up long ribbons of turf. Then they slice those ribbons into bricks, each one about 1 foot wide and only 3 or 4 inches thick. A house the size they need, roughly 14 feet by 16 feet, will swallow close to an acre of broken ground and around 3,000 of these bricks. And here's the detail that everyone overlooks. The bricks have to be laid the same day they're cut, because once they dry out, they fall apart in your hands. They lay the first course grass side down, and they stagger every brick so the seams never line up, the same way a mason staggers stone. The walls climb thick, 2 to 3 feet through, far heavier than any wooden wall they had ever lived behind. And then something strange and useful starts to happen inside those walls. The grass roots packed into the bricks are still alive. Over the following weeks, those roots grow up into the brick above them, knitting the whole structure together until it becomes a single living mass of earth. The house was, in a real sense, still growing. The roof is where most soddies failed, and this family knows it. They lay support poles across the top, cover them with brush, then add another layer of sod laid grass side up. When the rains come, that roof can soak up water until it weighs more than 3 tons, and a badly built one will sag, leak, and drip mud onto everything below for days after the storm has passed. It seems like a small thing in the dry warmth of summer. It wasn't. A roof that failed in the middle of January could come down with the whole family underneath it. Once the shell is up, the inside still has to become a home. The family smooths the dirt floor by dampening it and packing it down, sweeping it over and over until it sets almost as hard as concrete. They line the rough interior walls with plaster where they can afford it, or paste them over with old newspapers to brighten the dim space and keep loose soil from crumbling inward. And across the ceiling, they tack a sheet of canvas, stretched tight for one very practical reason. Things fall out of a sod roof. Dirt sifts down constantly, insects work their way through the bricks, and on the worst days, a bull snake or a mouse that had burrowed into the walls could drop straight onto the table below. The canvas catches all of it before it lands in the supper. It is a strange way to live by modern standards, yet swept clean, lined and furnished with a few prized pieces hauled across the country by wagon, a soddy could be a genuinely respectable home. And when it's finished, the family has something no timber cabin on the plains could match. Those 2 to 3 feet of packed earth act like a battery for heat. The thick walls soak up warmth from a small iron stove and release it slowly, holding a steady temperature while the weather outside swings to violent extremes. There are no gaps for the wind to scream through, the way it does through the cracks in a board cabin. In summer, the inside stays cool. In winter, with that one stove burning, the family can sit in a room that feels almost mild while the prairie outside turns to solid ice. In other words, they had built themselves a refrigerator that works in reverse. The walls were only half the equation, though. The other half was fuel, and fuel was the part that killed people. On a prairie with no forests, there was almost nothing to burn. So the family spent the warm months gathering everything that would catch a flame. They twisted dry prairie hay into tight bundles they called cats. They collected old corn cobs and woody sunflower stalks. And above all, they walked the grassland with gunny sacks, collecting the dried cattle and buffalo dung that pioneers politely renamed surface coal or grassoline. It burned hot and surprisingly clean once it had dried in the sun, though the smell took some getting used to. All of it went into a chip shed in a dry corner of the house, a hoard of fuel that had to last from the first frost all the way to spring. The clock on that fuel pile was already ticking. The family just could not hear it yet. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The fall of 1880 came in mild and green across the Central Plains and the Dakota Territory, the kind of warm autumn that lets a family relax and assume they have weeks left to prepare. That comfort did not last. On the 15th of October, 1880, weeks before anyone expected real cold, a massive blizzard swept down across the prairie and buried it in snow. And this is the part that caught thousands of families completely off guard. The snow that fell that October never fully melted away. It would stay on the frozen ground, storm after storm, until the following spring. What followed became known as the hard winter, the long winter, the season that some survivors simply called the starvation winter. Blizzard after blizzard dropped more than 11 feet of snow on many communities across the region. The railroads were the lifeline of every frontier town, and now they vanished under drifts so deep that the trains physically could not push through. Crews dug the tracks out by hand, and the wind packed them shut again before the next train could arrive. Pay attention to this next part, because it explains why a sealed, well-built sod house still was not a guarantee of survival. With the trains stopped, the towns were cut off from the outside world for months. No new food, no new fuel coming in, no coal, no flour, nothing. If you are finding the way these families engineered their survival as fascinating as I do, take a second to subscribe, because I break down frontier skills and forgotten survival craft like this every single week. Now, let's get into the hardest stretch of that winter. By February of 1881, the situation on the plains had turned desperate. Snow was falling on most days of the month, and the fuel that families had so carefully stacked back in the fall was running dangerously low. This is the moment when all that summer preparation either paid off or fell apart. A family that had gathered enough twisted hay and dried chips could keep that one stove burning and ride the season out inside their warm earthen walls. A family that had underestimated the winter was now feeding the fire with furniture and fence posts, anything left that would catch, watching the pile shrink with no train and no thaw anywhere in sight. Twisted hay was the cruelest fuel of all because it burned out almost as fast as you could push it into the stove, which meant someone had to sit and twist fresh bundles for hours just to keep one fire alive. When a lump of bought coal could be found, families burned it a single piece at a time, slipping one into the stove late at night so the fire would not die before morning. And to get through the coldest hours, they heated a flat iron by the stove, wrapped it in cloth, and carried it to bed to lay against their feet. Inside the soddy, the walls kept doing exactly what they were built to do, and the family stayed warm. But warmth does not feed you, and warmth does not refill an empty fuel pile. Their entire world had shrunk to the few feet between the house and the barn, where their animals waited to be fed, and even that short trip could turn deadly. When a whiteout rolled in, the blowing snow erased everything at once: the ground, the sky, the barn standing just yards away. People who stepped outside to tend their livestock could lose all sense of direction in seconds and freeze to death within sight of their own front door. So families across the plains did the only sensible thing left to them: they tunneled. They dug passages straight through 10 and 11 feet of packed drift, burrowing from the house to the barn so they never had to step into the open air at all. I mean, think about that for a second. To feed a single cow, you first had to dig a tunnel through a wall of snow taller than your house. In the towns, committees formed to ration out the little food and fuel that remained so that every family got a fair share. Out on the isolated homesteads, families simply moved in together, crowding into one soddy to share a single stove and a single dwindling supply. There's a reason this winter is still studied and written about more than a century later. It pushed ordinary people to the very edge of what shelter and preparation could do. One settler's diary from those months described the worst part not as the cold at all, but as sitting in near darkness day after day once the lamp oil ran out and the blowing snow had buried the windows. The walls were holding. The fuel was holding just barely. The mind was the harder thing to keep warm. And then, in the late spring of 1881, the snow that had ruled the plains for half a year finally broke. But the prairie had one last cruel surprise waiting for everyone who had survived it. What happened next is the part of this story that still feels unfair. After months of families enduring the deep freeze inside their sod houses, the danger did not end when the warmth returned. It got worse. The thaw came fast, almost violently fast, melting that enormous snowpack in a matter of days. All of that water had nowhere to go. Rivers across the region swelled and burst their banks. Ice jams clogged the channels and then tore loose in moving walls of water, and the flooding ripped through the low-lying towns. Communities that had endured the entire winter were damaged or washed away in the span of a single week. By the most sobering measure of that whole year, more lives were lost in the floods of that spring than during the entire long winter that came before it. The families who made it through did so because they finally understood what their environment had been teaching them all along. The same earth that nearly buried them was the thing that had kept them alive. So when you look back at a sod house today, it is tempting to see only a primitive box of dirt that people lived in because they had nothing better. The reality is closer to the opposite. Those families took the one resource their treeless world offered them and turned it into some of the smart survival engineering on the American frontier. Walls that stored heat like a battery. A structure that grew stronger as its own living roots knit it together. An entire season of fuel gathered and rationed with the discipline of people who knew that a single mistake meant death. The principle they leaned on, using the mass of the earth itself to hold a steady temperature, is the very same principle behind the earth-sheltered and passive homes being built right now, almost 150 years later. The sodbusters were, in a very quiet way, ahead of their time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you'd like to continue watching more of my videos on frontier skills, you can click the video on the screen now.